Hello, and welcome to the T Group training video. So the T stands for training, and the original version of this practice was originally created in the 1940s. And the version that we'll be talking about today is the one that I've been developing in the last 4 years that I've been teaching it. So these are going to be the structures that I've created that we'll be using in all of the cohorts and Sunday night gatherings and all of the things. So to begin, we can think about T group in a general sense as essentially being a social laboratory, one where you're both the experimenter and the subject at the same time. So when you step into this laboratory, you're stepping outside the rules of normal conversation. And you're going to begin experimenting with a very different way of communicating and connecting. And the practice consists of two primary movements. The first one is inward, and the second is outward. And you'll find yourself flowing back and forth between them organically. So the inward movement focuses your attention fully inside of yourself to study the thoughts, feelings, impulses, and responses that are unfolding within you from moment to moment. And the level of presence and mindfulness that is required to do this makes it very much like a meditation. And practicing like this, it strengthens your ability to know and name the experience that you're having in the present moment. And that self-awareness is the foundation for all of the advanced communication practices and relationship skills that we practice and study in our T groups. And the outward movement is about communicating your experience to the group using the T group guidelines. And this will invite you into a level of transparency and vulnerability that is relatively uncommon in our culture. And you'll find yourself revealing things that you would ordinarily conceal. And also, you will find yourself receiving a kind of candid and honest feedback from others, which is rare for most of us. And that really is the primary experiment of T group. What happens when we reveal the truth of how we are actually experiencing ourselves and each other in the present moment? What's important to acknowledge, though, is that there are skillful ways to do that, and there are definitely unskillful ways to do that. And so the primary purpose of this video is to help you distinguish between the two. And I'll be sharing a model I created that will help you do that. And then also, I created the T group guidelines by synthesizing what I believe are some of the best communication tools out there. So by practicing them again and again in your group, not only will you learn to share your authentic, true experience in a skillful way, you'll also internalize the principles of effective communication and rewire your relational habits. So we'll be studying the principles and a lot more, especially in the weekly talks of the cohorts. But cognitive insight alone is not enough to create real change in how we show up in relationships. Only practice can do that, and that's what we're here to do. So lastly, in this practice, you're going to be asked to think and speak in ways that are likely to be unfamiliar and possibly even a little uncomfortable. So please be patient and gentle with yourself and your group mates while you're still learning. And also, please give yourself permission to learn by trying. Nobody's going to get this perfectly when they're first starting out, or ever for that matter. So instead, let's learn to celebrate practice and let go of perfect. So to really break down the difference between skillful and unskillful communication, I created a model that I call the 4 acts. Now, the 4 acts are internal behaviors, subtle internal behaviors, and they're happening in every moment. They often trigger each other, creating a chain reaction that just loops and loops and loops. And it is very often so subtle that we don't see it at all. And so the inward movement of self-study that we practice in T group is largely about learning to see and observe the 4 acts. And as we'll see shortly, we're not trying to stop them from happening. Instead, our only objective is to cultivate awareness of them, because that awareness is what will make the difference in how our communication unfolds. So each act has a corresponding error and a corresponding skill. When we have that greater level of awareness, not only do we become increasingly immune to the errors, but we also empower ourselves to cultivate the skills, which are precisely the tools that we need to create healthy and authentic and generative relationships at home, at work, everywhere. And with less awareness, we become more likely to fall into the errors, which lead to the kinds of difficulties and conflict that we've all experienced in relationship at one time or another. So the 4 acts are noticing, interpreting, feeling, and responding. So the first act, the act of noticing. So there's a pervasive yet mistaken assumption that people make all the time, which is that their experience is an exact replica of the outer world. And some of the most fascinating contributions of neuroscience has been to show us some of the mechanisms by which the brain gathers and sorts and prunes and interprets the data that it receives, only then returning some kind of compilation or best guess to our conscious awareness. In fact, there's so much data bombarding our senses at all times. And so the brain has to figure out what to do with all of that. So what this implies is that to greater and lesser degrees, we're all experiencing our own unique version of reality. And therefore, we can't assume that our experience is the full or complete truth of what's out there. So I call noticing an act because some part of our brain is choosing for us what to notice and what to disregard, because once again, we just can't notice all of the billions of bits of data we're being bombarded with at all times. And I don't think we're ever going to gain conscious control over that instantaneous brain function. But the good news is that we don't need to. All that we need is the awareness that our noticing is not always complete, and that others' versions of reality are likely to be different from our own, and that nobody's necessarily wrong. We're equally subjective, in other words. And so when we're not fully aware of all of this, the act of noticing and what that means, we become more likely to fall into the error, which I call double blind spot. So without that awareness, you're likely to make the unconscious and automatic assumption that you're noticing everything there is to notice, that you're seeing whatever there is to see. So the first blind spot is that you're not noticing everything. You're not seeing everything there is to see. The second blind spot is that you don't realize that you're not noticing everything. So you're blind to the fact of your semi-blindness, double blind spot. So when we have greater awareness of the act of noticing and can keep that in mind, that there's more to reality than what we can see, then we're more likely to cultivate the skill of humility. And humility comes from always acknowledging that you can't see everything that there is to see all the time. And it's about recognizing and being honest about your limitations as a human being. And lastly, another part of humility is acknowledging that your perceptions and your perspectives are unique and peculiar to you and not the ultimate or final word on objective reality. And the skill of humility is so important because, well, when you're stuck in the error of double blind spot and you're communicating from that place, what you inadvertently wind up conveying is something like this. My version of reality is the truth. It's truer than your truth, and I'm going to tell everybody what is happening here. I call that pattern reality naming, which is when one person feels somehow empowered or entitled to declare what reality is for everybody. And naturally, people don't like to be on the receiving end of that very much. So, though the skill of humility does allow you to fully speak what you're experiencing, even passionately or intensely, it also requires you to acknowledge that it is only your experience. And so people will be much more open to hearing you if you make it clear that you're also open to hearing them. And okay, so let's move on to the second act, the act of interpreting. So once the brain chooses what to pay attention to, the next thing it has to do is assign meaning to what it notices. So as human beings, it's often not too difficult for us to agree on what things are in a literal sense. But when it comes to what things mean, we have a much harder time coming to consensus. So, like noticing, a great deal of interpreting happens instantaneously and outside of our conscious awareness or control. And so, once again, we're not trying to stop or control them. We're simply becoming aware that interpreting is something our brain and mind is doing, and it is having an impact on creating our experience. Just that awareness is what we're going for. When we don't have that awareness, we're likely to fall into the error, which is projection. And this is when we immediately and unconsciously believe our own interpretations with no awareness of having done it. The roots of the word project literally mean to throw forward. So when you believe your own interpretations, it's as though you have thrown them forward. But then you perceive them as though they're actually out there, and you don't quite realize that you're the one who put them there. So although much of our interpreting happens through instantaneous brain processes that you can't hope to control, there is another meaning maker inside of you that you can have a great deal more influence and choice around. And that meaning maker is the voice that we all have in our head, the one that's constantly talking, constantly narrating our lives and telling the story of me. And when you have little awareness of that voice or what it is saying, it's like you become kind of hypnotized by it, immediately accepting everything that it says. And you kind of begin to live in the error of projection. As humans, we really like being right. And we also really like imagining that we are in control. So the error of projection can be difficult to overcome because it gives us the illusion of both rightness and control. And when we have greater awareness of this interpreting, we're more likely to cultivate this skill, which is inquiry. And we cultivate that skill by learning how to listen to that inner storyteller. Now, that may seem simple, and it is simple in principle, but it's really difficult in practice. And what it does actually is it profoundly and fundamentally changes the landscape of your consciousness. Before you learn to listen, it's like there's only one thing in your head, and it's the voice. It's the voice, and you're kind of identified with it. So it's just in there by itself. And we're assuming that it and self are the same thing. But when you learn to start listening, all of a sudden, now there are two things in there. There's the voice, but now there's this other thing that's listening to the voice. So which one is me? So when we say that consciousness evolves or that there's a higher state of consciousness, this is kind of what we mean. When a mind can turn around and look at itself and be aware of its own nature, see what it is doing, and then can question itself. This is the kind of mind that can change itself on purpose. And so over time, as you're practicing this inquiry, listening to the voice and kind of questioning what it says, you come to identify a lot more with the listener rather than continuing to be fused and identified with and kind of hypnotized by the storyteller. And that breaks the hypnosis. And then that allows you to choose whether or not you will believe and act on what the voice is saying. And that choice translates into freedom and power. And the skill of inquiry is especially important in relationships because when you're stuck in the error of projection, what you're inadvertently saying is, I know the truth about you and I'm going to set the record straight, and therefore I'm justified in responding the way that I am right now. And once again, people don't like to be on the receiving end of that. And here's the thing also, you can never have the full or complete truth about anything other than yourself. And even that is hard sometimes. And even if you are seeing something that is genuinely true about someone else, what they have that you will never have is the ability to see that truth in its full context. They can see how it connects to every other part of their life. And they can also see how it arose from every part of their history. So if you were to assume that the tiny grain of sand truth that you are holding is somehow more true than the universe that they have access to, not only is that kind of ridiculous, but it could also be insulting. And so when you practice the skill of inquiry, you'll still hear that voice inside trying to interpret things for you, but you have a choice about whether or not to believe it. And then if you choose to, you can present that story to someone and say, okay, this is what I'm thinking. Am I getting that right? And that communicates something more like this. I'm willing to let you be the authority about you. And people really appreciate that. Okay, so the third act is the act of feeling. So human emotion is complicated. Even in the sciences, the jury is still out when it comes to definitively pinning down exactly how our emotions get made and where they come from. However, it is abundantly clear that a great many of our emotions they arise from believing what that inner storyteller is saying, from believing our own interpretations. And so here in this video and in our T groups, we're only concerned with those feelings because those are the ones that we do have choice about and that we can be responsible for. So I'm calling feeling an act because ultimately you are the one creating and generating those feelings, even if you don't currently have any awareness of doing it. So when we're not fully aware of the act of feeling, we're more likely to fall into its error, which is blame. And if you can't see the role that you play in the creation of your own feelings, then you're naturally going to assume that others are to blame for them. And blame can also be difficult for us to overcome, also because of our very human love of being right. But something else we tend to really love is being innocent. So if someone else is guilty, not only does it let us feel right, but it lets us feel innocent. And when you learn how to connect your feelings back to the stories that the storyteller created, sort of reverse engineering that process, that's how you cultivate the skill of feeling, which is self-responsibility. And this skill lets you understand more deeply where your feelings are actually coming from and how they're being made. And when you see that, it becomes a lot harder to blame someone else for them. And although blame does seem to let us off the hook in the moment, it winds up being profoundly disempowering because it makes it seem like other people or circumstances have control over what happens in our internal space. And that actually isn't really the case. So although cultivating responsibility might seem like a lot of work at first, what it is ultimately doing is giving you the power to choose what happens within you, no matter what anyone else is doing. And the skill of self-responsibility is important in our relationships because, like projection, blame is it's an inflammatory relational tactic. And essentially what you are probably inadvertently saying, but still saying nonetheless, is you are responsible for what's happening inside of me right now. I'm feeling badly and it's your fault. And again, people really don't like to be on the receiving end of that. And the statement isn't true anyway, because you created that feeling and not them. And together, the skills of inquiry and self-responsibility allow you to do two things that are much more effective in relationships. First, your inquiry interrupts the chain reaction. When you can question and let go of your own stories, they lose the power to stir up unpleasant feelings in your body. But we can't catch all the stories all the time. So when the unpleasant feelings do arise, the skill of self-responsibility shows you where they're actually coming from, and that keeps you out of the error of blame. And when you communicate from the place of self-responsibility, what you're saying there is, I will not hold you responsible for the things that I am doing and for the things that are happening within me. And people tend to really appreciate that. So much of our self-defense in relationships is shielding ourselves from projection and blame. And so when you are not projecting and you are not blaming, then people can really let their guard down around you. They can begin to open up and trust you. And it's only in that kind of space that you can create the kind of understanding, connection, or reconciliation that you might want. Okay, so the fourth and final act is the act of responding. And this is the final link in the chain reaction, and it is the result of everything that came before it. So in the first step, noticing drives interpreting, and then interpreting drives feeling, and then finally feeling drives responding. And responses are the impulses or the specific behaviors that feelings motivate us to take. And that's kind of the point of emotions, is to get us to do stuff. They motivate specific actions. And so when you're not fully aware of the act of responding, you're more likely to fall into this error, which is compulsion. And compulsion is when you immediately enact those specific behaviors, immediately act on that impulse without question. And before I say any more about this, I want to pause and point out that we all do this all the time. And there's a spectrum. There's like all the way over here, it's like tiny little compulsions that are mostly benign. And then all the way over there, yeah, that can get pretty destructive. But like, let's understand that it's not black or white. It's not all or nothing. And we're all doing this all the time. And the point of me saying that is, once again, to remind us to be patient and gentle with ourselves while we learn this. But if we get all the way to this part of the chain reaction and we are sliding into the error of compulsion, by that point in time, things have already gone pretty far off the rails. First, we've assumed that we're seeing everything there is to see. Second, we've believed and projected our own story about things. And third, when those stories trigger feelings inside, we blame those feelings on someone else. And then finally, arriving at responding, we've whipped ourselves into such a froth that we are immediately compelled to act on the impulses. And we all have this experience of that overwhelming compulsion that we are seem powerless to stop in the moment, but then feel really bad about later. That's what this is. But because those compulsions are based on quite a bit of faulty information, they're highly unlikely to produce the outcomes you would like. And instead, they're more likely to make things quite a bit worse. And so the skill of responding, when we're aware of how our own impulses get generated and that we actually have choice and responsibility around those, that's when we start to cultivate the skill of grace. And as I've pointed out, in the chain reaction of the 4 acts, we can create a great deal of upset within ourselves. We can even trigger ourselves to the point where our nervous system goes into fight, flight, or freeze. And when that happens, we have a lot less access to the higher brain centers that give us logic and reason and the ability to generate creative ways of handling things. And when you can be aware of the impulses without immediately acting upon them, not only can you avoid triggering yourself, but you create a little gap of space where you can more carefully and creatively consider how you want to respond. And when you're not so triggered, your brain works better and you'll see things more clearly and you'll probably be able to come up with better ideas about how to respond. And so grace is the ability to choose in every moment how you will respond to a person or a situation. It's the power to not be overcome by the impulses and retain access to your wisdom and your tools and your perspective. And this is one of the most difficult practices of all, how to maintain that composure when other people are doing whatever they do that really gets under your skin. So the last thing I want to say about this is that if you're connecting with someone and they know how to tip off this chain reaction in you, and you don't have the ability to stop it, who has the power in that situation? They do. And that's a bummer. And the reason they do, because sometimes we can feel really powerful when we're in compulsion, because it can be like forceful act, it can feel powerful. But we're actually really quite disempowered because we're not at choice about how we're showing up. Another person has started something that we were powerless to stop. And so that means they are the one with the power in the situation. So grace is the skill that allows you to be at choice about how you will respond no matter what anyone else is doing. And that translates into freedom and power. And when you can maintain that kind of composure, you retain access to your higher powers of creativity and perspective, which means you're far more likely to be able to create the results that you want in your connections. So let me repeat that all 4 of the acts are almost certainly going to continue happening inside of you and me and everyone. But by simply becoming aware of them, you become the one who sees the acts rather than just becoming them and acting them out without choice. And so not only does that allow you to avoid the pain and difficulty of the errors, but it also grants you the freedom, power, and choice of the skills. Okay, so now let's turn our attention to the T group guidelines and how we will use them in the practice sessions. So when your small group very first gathers, the first thing you'll do is sit in silent meditation for about 2 minutes. And this meditation is simply to help you transition from one activity to the other, and also to give you a moment to check in with yourself internally to discover what you are arriving with that day. And then we'll move on to check-ins. Everyone will have a minute or 2 to describe their current state of being, and also to share the backdrop, which are the current life events that are impacting my current state of being. And the invitation here is to avoid the temptation to kind of gloss over and simplify things, and instead practice being more specific and saying what's really going on for you, maybe challenging yourself to be a bit more open than you might feel comfortable with, just a little. And once the last person has checked in, then you'll go right into the T group process, and that's where you'll be using all of these printed materials. So let's start with the handheld card, the one that says the T group guidelines at the top. The first 3 prompts form the core of the practice, and you'll use them or some variation in almost all of your communications. And the second set of prompts are optional. You're welcome to experiment with them at your own discretion, though I do suggest sticking to the first 3 when you're still learning. So the first prompt, when, this one corresponds to the act of noticing. Sometimes you'll say when you, if you're responding to someone or to the group, and sometimes you'll say when you just want to point towards something that's happening in your own experience. Now, the point of this prompt is to get you to take a moment and find the specific thing that you are noticing and responding to. This prompt asks you to notice what you notice, and in doing that, this is to help you avoid the error of double blind spot. Now, the most common difficulty that people have with this prompt is to confuse observable facts with analysis. For example, observable facts would sound something like this. When you crinkled your brow and broke eye contact with me. And an example of analysis would be when you judged me. When people are stuck in their analyses, they often find it hard to backtrack and point towards the specific concrete thing that the person actually did or said. But when it comes to giving people skillful and effective feedback, simply giving them your analysis is usually not helpful, And in fact, it's likely to inspire their defensiveness. So if you can point to what they actually did or said, and then share how you experienced that thing, that is the kind of feedback that people can actually use. And it is less likely that they will be defensive in response. So when you say when you or when I in a T group, it should only be followed by observable facts. And when you remember that you're not capable of noticing everything all the time, and when you're willing to let go or hold lightly your own analyses and stick more to observable facts, both of those help to cultivate the skill of humility. And the second prompt corresponds to the act of feeling. Obviously, it is I feel. And this one is asking you to reveal the emotional part of your experience with as much honesty and vulnerability as you can muster. And sooner or later, you'll come to a moment where you're feeling something that is difficult or frightening to reveal. And this is what can make T groups so powerful. We get to experiment with being a lot more honest about who we are and what we're feeling. And we get to see what actually happens when we do that, because it's often not at all what we imagine, in a good way. And the most common difficulty people have with this prompt is to confuse feeling words with story words. For example, if I were to say, I feel judged, I have not told you how I feel at all. I have told you what I think you are doing. I think you are judging me. And that is a story. It's an interpretation and definitely not a feeling. And it is also me falling into the error of projection. I've believed my story that you are judging me to the point where I'm convinced that that is the truth of what you're doing. And so if you make sure to use the feelings wheel, you can feel confident that you're using real feeling words. And over time, this builds up your feelings vocabulary. Now, the main way to tell the difference between a feeling and a story, if you want to use a word that's not on there, is to ask yourself where the action of the word is happening. With our example of I feel judged, the action of judging can only happen in someone else's mind. And if it's occurring in someone else's mind, it can't be my feeling. But if instead I had said, I feel frustrated, the action of frustration is taking place inside my body, which is the only place that my feelings can happen. All right, so the third prompt has two parts. The first part is always because I. The second part, there's two options for the second part, and we'll get to that in just a moment. So let's put this together with the prompt that comes before. I feel X, Y, and Z because I. So this prompt is asking you to look within yourself for the source and the cause of your own feelings. Now, once again, I want to remind us that I'm not suggesting that we create 100% of our feelings. That is a slippery philosophical slope that we don't even need to go down, because the only thing I am suggesting here is that we create a certain subset of our own feelings by believing our own interpretations. That's the only category of feeling I'm talking about from here on out. And the point of T group really is to cultivate our awareness and our responsibility around that subset of feelings, the ones that we can have choice and control over, the ones that we are responsible for. And so there are two primary ways that we generate our own feelings, and those two correspond to the two options for the second part. So the first part is because I, and then the second part has two options because they are the two ways that we generate our own feelings. So we've already talked about how believing our own interpretations and stories can create our feelings. But another way that we do it is by wanting the present moment to be different from what it is. And I don't mean that in a negative way. Sometimes we want or need something different from what is happening right now, and our feelings arise as an alert to that fact. So the first option for using this prompt is because I have a story that. And And this prompt corresponds to the act of interpreting. It's asking you to listen to that inner storyteller and report on what it is saying. And this awareness helps you avoid the error of projection, and simultaneously, it helps you to cultivate the skill of inquiry. And the second way to use the prompt is because I am wanting. Quite a few of us have a hard time really locating our true preferences, desires, and needs in the present moment. And there seem to be a few inhibitions on the open expression of wants and needs in our culture. So I created the wants list to help you map out and claim what your true preferences are. And claiming and speaking your true preferences is another big part of self-responsibility. And so I'm using the word want instead of need on purpose in the context of T group, not in any other context. So all of the things on the wants list, they are actually needs in the sense that they're necessary for our health and well-being. But the word need is problematic. The needs of infants and people with severe illness and the elderly, their needs are very different from the needs of adults who are capable of sustaining themselves. For one, these adults are very capable of meeting their own needs, and they can also go a lot longer without having them met. And that can't be said of infants or people with illness or the elderly. And so really we just need two different words, but we don't have that really in English. So for T group, we're going to stick to the language of wants and preferences just because it's more accurate to who we are in this group. And the most common difficulty that people have with this prompt, because I, is that we all have a tendency to think of our own experience in terms of what other people are doing. For example, if you were to ask someone, hey, how are you doing? It's not uncommon to hear a report of what someone else in their life is doing. For example, I might say, hey, how are you? And what I get back is, my sister is being so cold and distant again. It's awful and unfair. That person is trying to tell me about themselves. But what all they've actually given me is a report or a story about someone else. This is an incredibly common way of thinking and speaking, that I'm feeling this way because of what someone else is doing. But this assumption is really the heart of the error of blame. And so when we practice with the phrase because I, we sidestep blame and cultivate the skill of self-responsibility. And so now you have the full download for the core part of the T group guidelines. And so now we'll spend just a minute unpacking the three optional pieces. So the first one is another part of me feels X, Y, and Z, and then just putting another part and then going through the whole core part again. So the idea behind this is simple. We often feel more than one thing at a time. And remembering to take this inventory of the different parts of yourself is especially helpful in difficult conversations or conflicts. Because even when we're angry or frustrated, we're often also sad or lonely or something like that at the same time. We can even be, longing for connection and reconciliation, maybe. But if we don't say what the other parts of us are feeling, then the other person isn't going to know it. And if all they see is our anger or frustration, then they have an incomplete image of us, and that's the only image that they can respond to. All right, and the second optional piece is what would help me is. And this prompt asks you to state in very specific and concrete terms what someone else could do that would fulfill what you're wanting. And once again, this is something that sounds simple in principle, but is really hard in practice. Often when people try to do this, they'll make requests that are general and kind of global. And they sound like, what would help me is if you could be more considerate. This is either a totally accidental or semi-accidental insult, because the other person is so likely to hear that as you are not considerate, and that is only going to arouse their defenses. So the challenge with this prompt is to actually be really specific and concrete about what you want. Instead of saying, what would help me is if you could be more considerate, try instead something as specific as this. What would help me is if you could pause or allow there to be a pause when I finish speaking so that I can have just a moment to consider if I've said everything I need to say. So the point of using this prompt is to help us get better at making requests. The person you're speaking to in this T group, they totally might grant you what you're asking for, and that's fine. But in T group, they're not strictly obligated to either. They may choose instead to just observe and report on what it's like to receive your request. And that's okay too. And the third and final optional piece is what I'm hearing you say is X, Y, and Z. Did I get that right? Often in a T group, someone will express something that you don't immediately understand. And in that situation, you have a few options. First, you can not say anything and just simply observe what it's like when you lack comprehension. What happens in you when that happens? There's no rule in T group that you have to understand everyone all the time. Another option is to use just the primary 3 guidelines. Saying something like, when you said that last thing, I felt confused and nervous because I'm wanting to understand you better. You could also add, what would help me is if you could clarify the last thing you just said. But another option is to use this final prompt by repeating back what you think you heard them say and then asking them if you got it right. And I included this prompt in the guidelines for 2 reasons. First, learning how to play back the essential points that you think you heard from someone else is an incredibly valuable communication skill. And especially when you include the question, did I get that right? You're expressing the skills of humility, inquiry, self-responsibility, and grace all at the same time. And people really appreciate it when they see you putting in the effort to really understand what they're saying. And they also really appreciate it when you can be unattached to what you think and say, correct me if I'm wrong. And the second reason I included this prompt in the T group guidelines is because even though no one is obligated to make sense in T group, and no one is obligated to understand, I also wanted to include the best tools out there for navigating moments of confusion and misunderstanding. We are here to study ourselves for sure, but we're also studying what makes for strong relationships and healthy groups. And working towards clarity and alignment is an important part of that. And so lastly, keep in mind that you don't have to use all the guidelines all the time. You don't have to use them in the exact order they're written in. I called them guidelines instead of rules or whatever on purpose. I did that on purpose to give you freedom to try these out and work with them in your own way. And it would be so much better for you to say even just, I feel, or my story is this, to just say something, a little piece of it. It's so much better for you to do that than to say nothing at all. And also, that is the most simplified version of T group. At any moment, you can fall back on this simplified version, which is simply, right now I feel, or right now I notice. That is always available to you. And so, right at the very end, the last part of each T group practice session will be the checkouts. And just like how you shared your current state of being at the check-in, at the check-out, you have an opportunity to stop and notice how your state might have changed and share what kinds of thoughts and feelings you are leaving with. And this is also a great time to share whatever insights and discoveries or learnings that you've had with the group so that we can all share in it. All right, that's everything. Thank you so much for spending your time with this video. And I hope that your T group practice is as useful and transformative for you as it can possibly be.